My name is Mark, a recording angel. I've been observing this earth since the dawn of creation. The Most High has asked me to share my recordings with you. The following are my records of humans during the fascinating times when the desire of ages, Jesus the Messiah, came to this earth. And they're collected in this book, Victory of the Warrior King, the story of the life of Jesus. If today's recording contains situations which might be uncomfortable for younger listeners, I will mark the video with the words parental guidance recommended. Levi, at the temple in Jerusalem. Levi stood at the gate of the outer court of the temple. He loved Passover. Everyone who worshipped God assembled at Jerusalem for Passover, not just those in Israel, but also people from many neighboring countries and some distant ones. It was an exciting time. Today, Levi had received gate duty. It was his responsibility to give directions to the people entering the temple courts and to help them find what they needed. He had always been an avid people watcher, and Passover was the perfect time for that. Working the gates enabled him to see everything and everyone. A family approached him. "May I help you?" he asked.
"Yes,"
the young father said.
"We've brought a lamb for sacrifice, but we're not sure where to go."
"Ah, this must be your first time here."
"Yes,"
the man said.
"We have come to the Passover as..."
Levi smiled. "I understand. God will bless you for that. First of all, you need to take your lamb into this courtyard." He pointed. "Over on that side, a priest will inspect your lamb. If your lamb is perfect..."
"Oh, yes, sir. He is perfect. We would only bring the best."
The Levite nodded, remembering as a child bringing his perfect lamb and having the priest reject it, and then seeing it sold as a perfect lamb later for 3 times the money they had given him. A bitter knot twisted in his chest. "There's nothing I can do about it," he thought. "I understand," he said out loud, "but it needs to be inspected by a priest, so that's where you need to go. After that, the priest will instruct you on what you need to do, and the actual sacrifice is done inside the court of Israel. Your women and children can wait in the court of women while you take your sacrifice in."
"Thank you,"
the young man said, bowing slightly. The women in the group smiled shyly at Levi, and the little family proceeded in. Another young couple approached, carrying a small child. The child's eyes did not look right to Levi. Something was wrong, though he wasn't sure what. Also, the child's arms and legs dangled listlessly. "May I help you?" Levi questioned automatically. "Oh, please, yes," the father began. "Our child is ill. We have come with an offering to the Lord, and to pray for his healing." "You need to go directly to that priest." Levi pointed across the courtyard to the priest at the next gate. "He will direct you to the right place for your sacrifice and help you with the prayers to offer. May God heal your son. He is merciful." The little family headed in the direction indicated. The next group that approached looked wealthy. Their clothes were of finer fabric than the homespun wool and rough linen garments that most Jews wore. Levi looked at him, but before he could offer to help, the man asked, "Are you the one to give directions? Which way do we go to buy a lamb? We want to offer a sacrifice. Nothing but the best. Please direct us to the best vendors." With a laugh, Levi swung his arm toward the many vendors in the courtyard. "There's not a seller here that will admit he has anything but the best. You may choose from any of them. Do you have temple coins?" The man shook his head. "I have only drachmas." "Then you need to go to the money changers first and get your money transferred into temple currency. After you get them, proceed to any of these animal vendors here to purchase your sacrifice." Dismissing Levi with an abrupt nod, the pilgrim set off toward the money changers. Levi shook his head. He hated the money changers. He was not sure where the custom had come from of requiring only temple currency for purchasing animals and sacrifices and paying offerings. Pilgrims had to exchange their coins for Tyrian half-shekels. Although they depicted the head of a pagan god, the priests were more interested in the purity and consistent weight of the silver in them. And the exchange provided a golden opportunity for the money changers to cheat everyone coming to the temple. Though people knew they were being taken advantage of, they had no choice. But surely it was not God's will for his worshippers, who were already giving freely and out of love for him, to be cheated and leave feeling wounded by the very one they had come to worship. The noise was deafening in the animal market. The shouting of the money changers and those they were serving, the cries of the animals being sold and awaiting their death as sacrifices, and the vendors shouting the virtues of their wares, all blended into a cacophony that numbed the mind. Shaking his head, Levi turned his back to the noisy courtyard. He loved the Lord of Israel and his temple, and the privilege of serving there as a Levite, but the activities on the boundaries of the temple site always gave him a bad taste in his mouth and bitterness in his spirit. Another young man approached him with a small child. "I need to see a priest about an illness," he explained. The child looked intelligent and peered shyly at the Levite. When Levi smiled, the little one smiled back. "He looks like a bright child," Levi commented. "I am sure the Lord will heal him. First, you need to purchase a sacrifice." "We have no money," the young man sighed. "I see. The priest who diagnoses illnesses and offers prayers for healing is right over there. Take your little one to him and explain to him about your financial situation. Our God is a God of mercy who loves the poor and rich alike." "So they say," the young father muttered with more than a trace of bitterness in his voice. Levi suddenly stared at him. "Have I met you before? You look familiar." "Probably. Our country's not a large one, and we all assemble here in the temple 4 times a year when we're being devout." He grimaced, then blurted, "My name's David. I'm from Bethlehem." "Ah, well, I wish the best for your son." "It's not my son," David hissed. "It's me. Now I'll see the priest if you'll excuse me." Abruptly, he headed toward the priest that Levi had pointed out to him. Again, Levi shook his head. The Lord did love the poor as well as the wealthy. He was sure of it. Why else would he have given separate rules so that those who could not afford to offer a lamb to ransom their firstborn could substitute 2 pigeons? Surely the young man could still offer prayers for healing even if he could not purchase a sacrificial animal. It seemed only moments before the young man strode back out the gate at a furious pace. "David!" Levi called after him. "David, what did the priest say?" The supplicant turned to him, eyes blazing with fury. "The priest says I have leprosy, and that I'm unclean and banished from civilization." The blood drained from the Levite's face. "I am sorry. What about the boy?" "I asked if the priest could keep him here at the temple, like young Samuel in the stories we've been told. But they have no interest in a young boy, because I have no money to offer them for his keep, and am unlikely to come across any as a leper." He spat the word out. "What will you do?" Levi continued. "Do you have a wife? Family? What about your parents?" "I have no family." Anger tinged his words. "My father disappeared when I was very young, and my mother died shortly after Herod had the children killed in Bethlehem, one of his final crimes before he finally died. Would that he could have died a little earlier, for his soldiers killed my little brother, and my mother died of grief only days afterward." The young man's grief and almost palpable bitterness overwhelmed Levi. "I'll take Jonathan with me," David spat. "Perhaps he's better off in a colony of rotten lepers, with a father who cares for him, than in a place like this, with these so-called servants of God who care for no one." Then he disappeared into the crowd. Levi felt the same old confusion creeping back into his mind. He had served at the gate next to the priest and watched him diagnosing leprosy. Occasionally, worshippers with large amounts of money slipped them to the priest in addition to the required offering. They received a bill of good health, even though they had obvious scaly white patches on them, whereas poor worshippers, who might not actually even have leprosy, found themselves banished with the dreaded diagnosis. Surely it was not God's plan that such a serious procedure as determining leprosy would depend on the bribe one could afford. How could God allow this right in the courts of his house, his temple? Could it be that God was that way too? That seemed to be David's understanding. Angrily, Levi shook his head. "No," he said to himself, "I just can't believe that God would do that." Levi continued to serve at the gate and instruct the hundreds of people pouring in and out of the temple grounds. A small group of young men came through, apparently unmarried or too poor to bring their families along. They did not have a sacrifice with them, so he directed them to the vendors. They obediently headed toward them. Another vendor had come through a few minutes before with a new herd of lambs, and the temple servant in charge of cleaning up had not made it back to Levi's gate yet. "Excuse me, sir," he said as another man entered. "Watch where you—" "Never mind." he mumbled as the man swore and tried to clean his sandal off on the steps.
"This is disgusting," the temple visitor said. "I can't believe I stepped in this right on the steps going up to the house of the Lord."
Just as Levi started to apologize, the usual roar of the temple grounds suddenly swelled into a deafening panic. Levi heard the crash of tables overturning and the ping of coins hitting the pavement stones. People and animals screamed in terror. Above it all, he heard someone's voice. "My father's house should be a house of prayer. You have turned it into a marketplace and a den of thieves. How can you cheat people in the very presence of my father?" The money changers fled, almost knocking Levi to the ground as they hurried out. "And you," the man who had started the turmoil said, pointing at the priest in charge of prayers for the sick. The priest turned deathly pale. The small bag of coins he had hidden in his robe fell and scattered on the paving stones as he turned and ran. Levi pressed into the court so he could see more clearly. Priests fled in fear in every direction. The vendors ran too. The animals, without anyone on the other end of their ropes, wandered around, bleating and mooing, soon heading for the gates. Yet the worshippers continued to crowd into the temple courtyard. Edging closer, Levi wanted to see more of the one who had triggered the commotion. He smiled. The man had the courage to say out loud what Levi had always kept to himself. He must be a good man. Now the stranger was talking to the family who had the sick child that Levi had noticed earlier. Gently he lifted the boy from the father's arms and held him for a moment. Then the little one's arms suddenly twitched with life, and instead of hanging limply, pulled up to his chest. With one hand he reached up and touched his healer on the face. Levi pushed his way closer. The eyes that hadn't seemed to focus before were now clear and healthy and concentrating on the man holding him. The child let out a little giggle, and the man handed him back to his father. The father was speechless, but the mother burst into tears. "He's been healed. He's never been like this since he was born. Oh, thank you. Oh, praise God. Who are you?" she asked. The man just smiled at her. "Praise God," he said. "Thank Him, for all life and all good things come from Him." Then he spoke to other families, explaining to them that the Almighty never intended to cheat them, but welcomed their offerings in love as small tokens in response to the love and gifts He had to pour out on them. "Surely this is the best thing that has ever happened at our temple in my entire lifetime," Levi thought. "But I wonder how the priests are going to react to this." At the time, though, Levi didn't care. He just wanted to get as close to the man as he could. Samuel at Anon in Judea. Samuel stood as tall as he could on the banks of the Jordan, his legs spread wide apart, his hands clasped behind his back. He hoped he looked dignified and important. After all, his job was truly important. Father had gone back to his position at the palace of King Herod, and had given Samuel some money and allowed him to stay and tend to the needs of the Baptist. "Many of his disciples are very poor," his father had explained, "and we're not. The steward of the palace pays me well for what I do, and I'm happy to provide for John's needs. You remain here and keep an eye on him. He has many enemies, you know." Samuel had come to love the sharp-tongued preacher, and agreed with him that it was time for people to turn back to God, especially since the Messiah was somewhere in the land. It was no time for people to cling to cherished sins. Now the young man watched as John paused from his preaching and backed into the river to baptize more disciples into its depths. He frowned as he thought of the argument he had had with his cousin Andrew the night before. His cousin lived up in a fishing village in Galilee, but they had gotten to see each other during the Passover. Samuel kicked the ground in frustration. Andrew was now following the young teacher they had been hearing so many things about. Apparently, the man was a cousin of the Baptist, although they had not met except for his baptism some time before. Suddenly, Samuel scowled to himself. If he had come to the Baptist for baptism, then surely he was subordinate to the Baptist, and should teach his followers more respect. Yet his disciples seemed to believe that he was the Messiah, and that the Baptist was of less importance. Even more distressing was the fact that the crowds flocking to the Jordan were smaller than they had been. The crowds that Andrew described as following Yeshua grew daily, and now outnumbered the dwindling Jordan group. "It's not right," Samuel thought. "He's stealing disciples from the Baptist." He decided to speak with John about it later. In fact, he needed to talk with him anyway, for Father was very concerned. In his denouncing of sin, the preacher had also attacked the sins of the country's leadership. Condemning the sins of a Roman governor did not shock anyone, but calling the priests and rabbis vipers and whitewashed sepulchres were serious insults. He was making powerful enemies. Even worse, he had accused Herod Antipas, the ruler of the territory he preached in. Of course, Antipas had had a flagrant affair with his brother's wife, divorcing his own wife to marry Herodias, but the preacher could have used a little more tact. Like his infamous father, this Herod was not known for taking criticism well, and the Baptist ignored tact when it came to pointing out sin. Father said that word had gotten back to Antipas, leaving him furious. Samuel continued to watch the crowd. Father had worked in Herod's court many years, and Samuel recognized the faces not only of the palace servants, but also of the ruler's favorite agents, whom he sent out on spying missions. Already Samuel had seen some of them, several times. He had warned John about this before, but they were showing up on a daily basis now, increasing Father's concern. "I'll have to talk to him tonight for sure," the young man thought. That evening, as the crowds dispersed to their homes and darkness set in, the Baptist sat near the fire Samuel had prepared. "Your lentil stew is delicious," the preacher said. "Thank you so much, Samuel. This is quite an improvement on the years of locusts and honey." The boy laughed. "I can't imagine living on that stuff." John smiled. "It filled my stomach and kept me alive. I had more important things to think about, but I do appreciate a good lentil stew and fresh bread. Where did you get it?" "I bought it in the village." "You seem quite well provided for," the preacher observed. "I've been meaning to talk to you about this. My father serves in Herod's palace. He provided the dinner I bought and the other things." "Ah, that's a good thing. I'd much rather have you the son of a rich servant than a young thief who steals pots of lentil stew in order to feed your favorite preacher." They laughed. "I must talk to you, Rabbi." "Don't call me Rabbi. You know that no self-respecting rabbi would like to be considered in the same class as me." It was true, but Samuel didn't want to agree with him, for he had more respect for the Baptist than any rabbi he had ever met. "The spies from the palace are turning up here more often," he continued. "Father says that Herod has heard of the things you have said about his wife." John snorted. "You have to stop saying such things about them. He's getting really angry." The Baptist turned his steady gaze from the fire to Samuel. "I don't have to stop anything," he said. "I am making the way ready for the Messiah, and I have been sent to point out sin wherever it is. As long as the country's leaders are wallowing in their sins, God cannot bless the country. It's always been that way. Remember the stories of Ahab? Herod's no different. Unless he's willing to put away his sin and stop his evil behavior with her who should be his brother's wife, I will not stop denouncing him." Taking a breath, Samuel tried a different tactic. "Father says that a few days ago, Herod, after hearing the spies reporting on your comments, said that if you didn't stop, he was going to have them bring you in and make you say it to his face." John looked at him unblinking. "I would do that. I wouldn't say anything differently behind a man's back than I would tell him to his face." Samuel sighed. One thing you could say for the Baptist was that he was straightforward and took the same position no matter who was listening. "Please be careful," the young man begged. "I have grown to respect you and care for you very much, and it would sadden me if anything happened to you." The Baptist laughed. "Nothing will happen to me that the Lord doesn't allow, so don't worry." Shaking his head, Samuel wished he had the confidence that the Baptist had, but all he felt was a growing, gnawing fear inside him. "Is there anything else on your mind?" the preacher asked as he ladled a second bowl of the savory stew. "Yes. It's about that other young preacher, the one you baptized. His name is Yeshua." "Yes, my cousin." "Have you noticed that he's drawing such crowds that we're now losing disciples to him? You used to have lots more, and now many of them have left us to follow him." John nodded and finished chewing the mouthful he had. "None of us have a following, except that God impresses people to listen. If Yeshua has more followers than me,
It's because God wants it that way. And if my disciples are leaving me to follow him, then that is also the plan of the Almighty, and I approve.
But, Samuel sputtered, it's not fair. You've been preaching longer than he has. You baptized him. You should be the more important one. The Baptist stared into the fire for a long time, and then shook his head and turned to Samuel.
Not necessarily. At a wedding, the groom is delighted over his pretty bride, and friends of the groom should delight over his happiness and not be jealous of it. As time goes on now, Yeshua will increase in popularity. His crowds will get bigger, and his reputation will become even more widespread than it is now.
But what about you?
I guess I will decrease as he increases. I don't know. The Almighty has not revealed to me what his plans for me are. I just know I was here to prepare the way for Yeshua's ministry, for the Messiah.
He's the Messiah? John set down his bowl.
I think so. No, I am certain of it. And once the way is prepared, and people abandon their sin and follow him, perhaps he will overthrow the Romans. Whatever kingdom he sets up, it is the will of the Almighty. Perhaps then he and I will get together and be able to be the close cousins you and Andrew, as I always wished we could have been.
You were never close?
No, his parents were very poor and lived in Nazareth. My parents were more prosperous, but were old and ill and couldn't travel. We knew of each other, yet we have never spent any time together as families. I hope someday to do that.
Although Samuel nodded, he hoped in his heart that they wouldn't. Hating the young preacher who had lured so many disciples away from the Baptist, he wished that Yeshua would make some political mistakes and that his followers would return to the Baptist. This broadcast has come from the book Victory of the Warrior King by Sally Pierson Dillon, with permission from the Review and Herald Publishing Association. This book and the rest of the series, War of the Ages, can be purchased by going to www.adventistbookcenter.com or by calling 1-800-765-6955. I'm your narrator, Austin Backus, and this audio project is a gift to you from my free Christian book ministry, RXF 1888. Please visit our website, www.rxf1888.com, to request free Christian books for both kids and adults. And join us here again for more stories from Mark the Recording Angel.